everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Land Talks podcast, powered by the G20 Global Land Initiative, where we explore innovative ideas and impactful projects driving land restoration and sustainable development worldwide. Today, we are honored to have Professor Wayne Frederick Truter, the Executive Manager of the Green Futures Hub at the University of the Free State. With over 25 years of experience, Professor Truter specializes in land regeneration, focus on restoring mined and degraded agricultural land through innovative solutions. His work integrating soil, vegetation, water, and livestock systems is a shining example of how science and practice can come together to build sustainable futures. Doctor, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Professor Truter, your work focuses on the regeneration of mined and disturbed agricultural land. Can you explain the key challenges in restoring these lands and how your methods address these challenges?
Yes, certainly. I think some of the key challenges we have is that very often we have the incorrect land management systems in place. We sit with vast amounts of communities that are not necessarily aware of what it requires to manage land correctly, which then results in a lot of the degradation that we see.
Yes.
So a lot of the overgrazing of land, which we see where farmers do not necessarily understand the principles of grazing management. They very often have too many animals. If we move towards the surface mining context, there we sit with another challenge where miners are not always familiar with what are the requirements to restore the land which is then disturbed for mining.
Yes.
And that becomes a huge challenge as well. So it requires significant inputs from specialists to be able to understand how to regain the value of that land.
Okay, perfect. You emphasize the relationships between soil, vegetation, water, livestock, and wildlife. How do these interrelationships influence the success of land regeneration programs, and what have been your most significant findings in these areas?
Yes. So very often people say soil, water is life. I do believe in a lot of these restoration projects, soil is life. Without good quality soil, we can't retain the important water, which is also required for life.
Absolutely.
But together with that being said, to protect the soil, we need vegetation. And vegetation is the cover. It's like the clothes that we wear. And vegetation is that. It protects us from many external stresses from the environment, like heat, wind, you name it, flash floods. And the vegetation becomes really important. But vegetation won't grow if the soil is not in good condition.
Yes.
At the same time, if the soil is not in good condition, the water required by vegetation will also not be able to be retained in the soil. Be that as it may, all those three resources acting together, vegetation requires a manager. And that's where I love to bring in the livestock or animal component. The animal factor is so important in the sense that it has to control the vegetation cover. It has to stimulate the vegetation cover's growth. So the animal also has the ability to be able to convert the vegetation either from using nutrients for itself, but at the same time provide nutrients that are there to feed the soil again. So it becomes a closed circular system. And if you exclude any one of the three or the four, you sit with an imbalanced system, and it will never restore.
This was very well explained. So let's talk a little bit about sustainable land management systems. Your research involves developing sustainable and regenerative land management systems. Can you share an example of a project where these systems were successfully implemented and the impact they had on the community or the ecosystem?
Yes. So I can give you a great example,
Please.
which we're currently working with. where we're trying to you regenerate land. And with the whole regenerative agricultural approach, the principles are that nothing should leave the site which you're trying to regenerate. And that means whatever I grow there, if there is a product that is removed for human consumption or animal consumption, there is always a residue. And that residue should never be underestimated, its value, and should be reincorporated back into the soil. So a project that we're currently doing is where land is maybe not suitable to grow food crops. We've introduced crops that are of huge value to produce biomass, which could be used for anaerobic digestion, small bioreactors, which then give you a renewable energy. And at the same time, the derivative from that process is, again, a byproduct, which is fertilizer value. And that, again, gets then reintroduced into the soil that the biomass is then used again for. So it becomes, again, a circular initiative. And that is the importance of regeneration, because you're constantly putting something back into the soil. You're not just exporting everything out of an environment. Commercial agriculture typically does that. We import inputs and we export all the outputs, and we do not necessarily look after the residues. The residues aren't important. But if we can have a closed regenerative system, you'll be able to lower the amount of inputs you put in, and at the end of the day, the outputs might be of lower yield but of higher quality. And just looking at that cost-benefit analysis, you might not produce the highest yields, but you'll produce the yields much more economically and more sustainably.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Let's talk a little bit about revegetation and agriculture potential. So revegetation is the cornerstone of your approach to land regeneration. How do selective forages, pastures, and industrial crops contribute to improving the agriculture potential of degraded areas?
So I think what's really important from the onset when we restore land or reclaim land is that we need to know what the inherent potential is. Like I said previously, some land is not suitable for food crops. It might have a potential level of contamination, which is not suitable for food.
Yes.
But at the same time, you might be able to use a very specialized industrial crop, which that contaminant might not influence its quality. So, for instance, a fiber crop. You might be able to grow a fiber crop on that soil. What it does is that plant has the ability to extract that contaminant in some other particular way, but it ties it up into its plant material, which will then never have a further impact down the line.
Yeah.
And then that can be used for fiber. And that's it might even be used for fiber within concrete, for instance, which then becomes encapsulated. So we always talk about identifying the right plants for the right degraded landscape, because it might have a specific function. We've identified plants that can actually mine contaminants out of soil, and when you have a sufficient amount of biomass of that plant with contaminant in it, you can then generate renewable energy, and the ash component of that plant then contains the contaminant, which you can then chemically extract if it's economically viable. So it's just identifying the right vegetation for the right purpose.
Great. So as an executive manager of the Green Futures Hub, what's your vision for the future of land restoration, and how do you see your research shaping global conversation on sustainable land use and regeneration?
So I do believe, and that is probably the function that we're trying to achieve with the Green Futures Hub, is to try and bridge the gap between research, academia, and industry. I think there is a disconnect. I think very often industry or the private sector requires answers quickly. Research and academia do not necessarily work in that same time frame. And that sometimes creates the gap, because industry requires fast answers and just answers that can provide solutions quickly. When you look at academia and research, we're trying to make sure that the data we provide is confident, and that takes time. That takes replicability. You have to duplicate and that always doesn't meet the timeline of industry. But trying to bridge that gap, and that is through a process of extension. I've heard this quite a lot now lately, is that extension services is crucial. Being able to have skilled people that can take the academic research, distill it to a high level that industry and the corporate corporates can be able to use it and see the solutions, because everybody doesn't like to speak to a professor.
Yes.
It's going to sound too clever and it's going to be too difficult and too technical. At the end of the day, it's the basis of any innovation.
Of course. One final question. Based on your experience, what is the one universal truth about land restoration? I mean, what do you know for sure will happen when land is restored in the ecosystems or the landscapes you are working in?
So one thing that I do believe is true about land restoration, it will improve the quality of our resources. Cleaner water, healthier soil, cleaner air. There's no doubt that these interrelationships will improve when we restore the land. So it's crucial that we have to restore the land, starting with the soil. I believe, as a soil scientist, start with the soil and you will improve the rest. And that, to me, is the true thing about land restoration.
Professor Truter, I don't want this conversation to come to an end, but sadly we come to our end of today's episode. So thank you so much for being our guest today. And for our listeners, stay tuned for more and more podcasts from Land Talks, brought to you by the G20 Global Land Initiative. Thank you and goodbye.